Welcome to this presentation on women in the Old Testament with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's commentary. Hello, I'm Ken Walsh. My pronouns are he and him. I'm glad you could be with us today, and I'm particularly excited about this presentation because of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's wit and insights. I hope you will enjoy her commentary as much as I have. After a short introduction, I'll discuss how women have been portrayed and not portrayed in the Old Testament, and I will cover a few of my most admired women, Eve, Shiprah Puah, Deborah, Ruth, and Esther, along with other women. And I'll discuss the pointed insights of the women's suffrage pioneer, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. For additional information, please contact me directly at kenwalsh3@icloud.com. or on Facebook at Ken Walsh Author. My Facebook page includes directions to my Classroom Google page, which contains notes, maps, videos, paintings, and chapters from my books. I will display my contact information again at the end of my presentation. My presentation is based on three resources: my recent book, Bible Stories for All Without the Dogma, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's The Woman's Bible, and the Good News translation of the Bible. My book is available for sale online. The other two books are available for free online. By way of background, I taught the Old Testament and ancient history for 14 years at a tuition-free Jesuit inner-city middle school for boys from low-income families of various religious and non-religious backgrounds. My personal challenge was how to make everyone comfortable in my religion class, how to teach without preaching a particular religious point of view to children who range from evangelicals to non-church Christians, atheists, Buddhists, and Muslims. A real mix reflecting life today. I wrote my books for those who'd like to better understand Bible stories and their influence in Western culture, and to learn more about the history, geography, and cultural practices of the time. After all, the Bible stories did not happen in a vacuum. If you're interested in just the basic facts and their context, I hope you will enjoy my work. Let's talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had long felt that it was not divine will, but the human interpretation of the Bible that was used to dominate women. In 1894, the Church of England published the first revised edition of the Bible in 200 years. While she was in accord with many of the revisions, she was so disappointed in its continued humiliation of women that she pulled together her own revising committee of 26 women to address the portrayal of women. The Women's Bible was published in 1895 and quickly became a bestseller. However, it was viewed by many suffragettes as an unwelcome distraction from their campaign. The suffragettes formally disassociated with the Women's Bible, and they marginalized Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony became the prime leader focused solely on the right to vote. Biblical scholars avoided the issue of sexism in the Bible until the 1960s and 70s, when biblical scholarship by women reemerged. Let's look at her concerns in writing a revised Bible for women. The following are direct quotes from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as published in the Woman's Bible. The object is to revise only those texts and chapters directly referring to women, and those also in which women are made prominent by exclusion. From the inauguration of the movement for women's emancipation, the Bible has been used to hold her in the divinely ordained sphere. The following quote sums up her feelings and her drive. Women have compelled legislators in every state in this union to so modify their statutes for women that the old common law is now almost a dead letter. Why not compel bishops and revising committees to modify their creeds and dogmas? And lastly, she said, the spirit is the same in all periods and languages, hostile to her as an equal. Let's look now at the Bible's portrayal of women, starting with this section of the first creation story. Then God said, and now we will make human beings. They will be like us and resemble us. They will have power over the fish, the birds, and all animals, domestic and wild, large and small. So God created human beings, making them to be like God. God created them male and female, blessed them and said, have many children so that your descendants will live all over the earth and bring it under their control. I'm putting you in charge of the fish, the birds, and the wild animals. God looked at everything God had made, and God was very pleased. Evening passed and morning came, and that was the sixth day. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 31 from the Good News translation of the Bible. As was her style, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would offer her commentary alongside the passages of the Bible pertaining to women. And these are her thoughts on the passage which we just read, which is commonly called the seven-day creation story. Here is the sacred historian's first account of the advent of woman. A simultaneous creation of both sexes in the image of God. It is evident from the language that there was consultation in the Godhead, and that the masculine and feminine elements were equally represented. The above texts plainly show the simultaneous creation of man and woman and their equal importance in the development of the race. Finally, no lesson of woman's subjection can be fairly drawn from the first chapter of the Old Testament. Let's look at a very different creation story, one describing Adam and Eve. In the next chapters of the Bible, God created a man from the soil and breathed a life-giving breath into his nostrils and placed him in the bountiful Garden of Eden. God told him that he could eat the fruit of any tree except the fruit from the tree of knowledge. God then created a woman named Eve. Later, a snake in the garden convinced Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, so she will be like God and know what is good or bad. Eve ate the fruit and gave some to Adam, who also ate it. Next, we have an artist's depiction of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. On a side note, you might ask, why did God put the tree there if God didn't want them to partake of its fruit? Some biblical scholars suggest that God was testing them. The concept of testing is common in many religions. We'll revisit testing later. Eve is described as falling to the snake's temptation to eat the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge and then giving the fruit to Adam. And she is often criticized as being weak and disobeying God. However, I have another perspective, one focused on the tension between compliance and curiosity, as symbolized by Adam and Eve. Curious folks are the creative ones who find new ways and inventions that improve civilization. Compliant folks are also needed to organize us in productive ways. I believe this story symbolizes the traits of compliance and curiosity that are so needed in a civilized world. I'd also like to share Elizabeth Cady Stanton's commentary. As to woman's subjection, on which both the canon and civil law delight to dwell, it is important to note that equal dominion is given to woman over every living thing, but not one word is said giving man dominion over woman. She goes on to note, the most important thing for a woman to note in reading Genesis is that the portion which is divided into the first three chapters, there was no such division until about 5 centuries ago, that it contains two entirely separate and very contradictory stories of creation written by two different but equally anonymous authors. And I love her conclusion. It is now generally conceded that someone, no one pretends to know who, at some time, no one pretends to know exactly when, copied two creation myths on the same leather scroll, one immediately following the other. Next, let's see where she goes with her logic. Moving forward, she made 3 points. The first account, the seven-day creation story, dignifies woman as an important factor in the creation, equal in power and glory with man. The second account, the Adam and Eve story, makes her a mere afterthought, the world in good running order without her. The only reason for her advent being the solitude of man. Next, she gets to the heart of the biblical patriarchal model. Accepting the view that man was prior in the creation, some scriptural writers say that as the woman was of the man, therefore her position should be one of subjection. Granted, then, as the historical fact is reversed in our day, and the man is now of the woman, shall his place be one of subjection? Instead of women dominating men, she ends on a note of simple equality. The equal position declared in the first account must prove more satisfactory to both sexes, created alike in the image of God, the heavenly mother and father. Not surprisingly, we next have a period of silent women. Adam and Eve had 3 sons, Cain, who killed his brother Abel, and a 3rd son later in life, Seth. 10 generations later, we come to Noah, who had 3 sons by his wife. And while the Bible names many generations of sons, the mothers are not named after Eve through the Noah story. None of the women have a speaking role. This slide reminds us of all these nameless and silent wives and mothers who suffered much and without whom we would not have the Noah story. It will come of no surprise that the overwhelming evidence supports that the ancient Near East societies were patriarchal. While women did clearly hold a number of high positions, including priestess and goddess, they lived in a society dominated by the power of males. For example, in hospitality, men hosted and talked. Women prepared the food and stayed in the background and observed. In fact, this is the storyline in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, when 3 travelers appear before Abraham and Sarah's tent. Abraham greets them, offers them water, food, and a resting place in the shade, while he goes into the tent to tell Sarah to bake some bread with her best flour. Sarah stays in the tent and is reduced to eavesdropping on the men. Let's discuss the next woman mentioned in the Bible, Sarah. The first book in the Bible is the book of Genesis, which describes the patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. While the matriarchs are not the focus of these stories, there is much said and not said about them. Let's start with Abraham and his wife, Sarah, who lived around 1800 BCE, before the Common Era. Their story was passed down by oral tradition and then recorded 800 years later, around 1000 BCE. Despite God's promise 10 years ago to give Abraham many descendants, Abraham and Sarah were still childless in old age. In accordance with the customs of the time, Abraham could do one of 3 things. First, he could do nothing and remain childless, or divorce Sarah and return her dowry, or take a concubine. In many cases, the wife would offer her slave. Sarah gave Abraham her slave, Hagar, and they had a boy named Ishmael. Abraham was allegedly 86 years old. Now they had a son who could inherit his wealth. Otherwise, Abraham's wealth would have gone to his chief slave. In the Abraham and Sarah story, we have several insights to women's feelings. First, Hagar came to despise Sarah, perhaps because Hagar was now the expectant mother of the cherished firstborn child to be. Sarah was allegedly so cruel in return that Hagar ran away. An angel convinced Hagar to return and promised her many more children. Then, 14 years later, when Sarah was allegedly 90 and Abraham 100, they had a son named Isaac. Years later, after the birth of Sarah's son, Isaac, Sarah convinced Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away forever, so their son, Isaac, would inherit Abraham's wealth. These are the only times we hear Sarah's voice. Perhaps she was being used as a foil for the need for faithfulness when she doubted God's promise of children and gave her slave to Abraham as a concubine. In sending Abraham's first son, Ishmael, away, we return to the story of God's promised son, Isaac. The next episode concerns God's command to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to God. Abraham followed the command and prepared to kill Isaac when an angel stopped him and announced that God now knows that you will honor and obey God because you have not kept your only son from God. Here's that religious testing message again. But as Abraham prepared to kill their son, where was Sarah in this story? Yet religious artwork shows Abraham embracing his son after he planned to kill him. Nowhere in the story is Sarah's feelings discussed. Traditionally, the major religions treat the Isaac story as a story of the need for faithfulness to God. Some scholars note that the story demonstrates that the God of the monotheistic Israelites differed from the polytheistic gods who practiced child sacrifice. The Israelites' God is sending a message that God does not demand human sacrifice, as the polytheistic gods do. Personally, I have a difficult time with the story of Abraham. He is the patriarch of three world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet he abandoned his firstborn son Ishmael and his mother Hagar. And in an unbelievable moment, he prepared to kill his remaining son Isaac because he's told to do so in a dream. Elizabeth Cady Stanton offers these comments. As Sarah did not possess any of the heroic virtues worthy of imitation, we need not linger either to praise or blame her characteristics. She goes on to note, does anyone seriously believe that the great spirit of all good talked with these Jews and said the extraordinary things they report? It was, however, a very cunning way for the patriarchs to enforce their own authority, to do whatever they desired, and say, the Lord commanded them to do, and say thus and so. Many pulpits, even in our day, enforce their lessons of subjection for women with the same authority. Thus saith the Lord, thou shalt and thou shalt not. As we continue our discussion on how women were presented in the Old Testament, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah stands out. Typically, it is glossed over or not covered in most religious books today. Two men arrive late in the day in the town of Sodom. Lot sees them arrive, and in accordance with the custom of hospitality of the time, he greets them and provides them with a meal and a place to sleep in his house. Before they go to bed, the men of the town surround Lot's house and demand that he brings the visitors out so they can have sex with them. Traditionally, religion has viewed homosexuality in the Sodom story as an offense to God. Several modern-day scholars have suggested that it was the inhabitants' lack of civility and hospitality that offended God, not the sex. However, the story notes how Lot went outside and told the demanding men not to do such wicked things to the visitors. Instead, he told them they could do whatever they want with his two virgin daughters. He needed to protect his two guests. And we learn that the daughters were engaged to be married. If you're wondering how this got to be included in sacred text, it gets worse with the post-destruction of Sodom. Lot tells his daughters' prospective husbands to leave with him, his wife and daughters, but they decide to stay. Sodom and its inhabitants, including their prospective husbands, are destroyed. Lot's wife looks back when she's told not to and turns into a pillar of salt. So it's just Lot and the two daughters who survive. It's not explained why they do not rejoin their relative Abraham's clan. With no men to marry so they can have children, the daughters decide that they will get their father drunk and have sex with him in order to get pregnant. And they each have sons who allegedly become the ancestors of the nearby Moabites and Ammonites. Here are a few thoughts on the history of that story. It was passed down by oral tradition over 800 years before they were recorded, and then existed for 1,000 years in written form before being accepted as Jewish scripture in the 1st century CE, the Common Era, and for 1,400 years before acceptance as Catholic scripture in the 4th century CE. Makes you wonder why anyone would tell such stories and then honor them in their sacred scripture. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a few thoughts I'd like to share with you about Lot's daughters. Indeed, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is a long, painful record of war, corruption, rape, and lust. Why Christians who wish to convert the heathen to our religion should send them these books fails all understanding. It is most demoralizing reading for children and the unthinking masses, giving all alike the lowest possible idea of womanhood, having no hope nor ambition beyond conjugal unions with men they scarcely knew, for whom they could not have had the slightest sentiment of friendship, to say nothing of affection. Elizabeth Cady Stanton then notes, the text on Lot's daughters we omit altogether, as unworthy a place in the woman's Bible. Like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I often wondered too, why such stories were included in Holy Scripture. The early Bible stories focused on the Israelite patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their wives, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, are described briefly in lesser supporting roles as wives and mothers. All three have difficulty getting pregnant. In a recurring theme that begins with Rebecca and Rachel, prayers to God for children are eventually answered. The story of Rebecca and Rachel reads like a novelette of a family's love stories, deceit, and trickery. You can read it all in the book of Genesis, chapters 25 through 27, or in the 9 pages of coverage in my book. However, I'm skipping the details today. Let me share a few observations. Rebecca and Rachel are basically supporting characters in the Jacob story with traditional family roles. They rarely speak, and when they do, it is about family matters. When Rebecca's family is approached about marrying Isaac, she's not consulted. Her father and brother agreed to the marriage. She was simply asked how soon she wanted to leave. The biblical stories clearly demonstrate that Isaac and Jacob loved their wives, but they do not describe whether the wives loved their husbands. Just like the Rebecca story, the Bible does not note how Rachel felt about marrying Jacob, or if she was consulted. There are so many biblical stories of death, destruction, and unspeakable cruelty, including floods, fires, slaughters, murders, and rapes. Yet every so often we have a biblical story that actually inspires us. And one of those is our next story, the short 6-verse story of the Egyptian midwives, Shiprah and Puah. It occurred 400 years after the Israelites had settled in Egypt, and is described in the book of Exodus, the account leading up to Moses' birth. The king of Egypt, also called the Pharaoh, was concerned that the increasing numbers of Israelites might side with an enemy if Egypt was attacked. He wanted to reduce their population. Here are the 6 verses of that story. The king of Egypt spoke to Shiprah and Puah, the 2 midwives who helped the Hebrew women. When you help the Hebrew women give birth, he said to them, kill the baby if it is a boy, but if it is a girl, let it live. But the midwives were God-fearing and did not obey the king. Instead, they let the boys live. So the king sent for the midwives and asked them, why are you doing this? Why are you letting the boys live? They answered, the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They give birth easily, and their babies are born before either of us gets there. Because the midwives were God-fearing, God was good to them and gave them families of their own. And the Israelites continued to increase and become strong. This is the story told in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 15 to 21. I cherish stories about common people doing the right thing, despite the risk of offending the powerful. And I love the midwife's explanation of their defiance of the king's orders, saying, the Hebrew women have babies so quickly and easily that they're born before they get there. Yet most religion books do not mention Shiprah and Puah, and if they do, very little is said or expounded upon. However, I believe in this little story, we have the essence of what religion should encompass, doing the right thing for others. Next, I'd like to discuss Deborah, but first a little background. Joshua succeeded Moses as the leader of the Israelites and led them out of Egypt into the promised land of Canaan. However, Canaan was already occupied. Joshua was successful after several battles in subduing the Canaanites and establishing an Israelite presence there. After his death, the Canaanites became more powerful and periodically conquered the Israelites. The period after Joshua was known as the time of Judges, when leaders called judges would temporarily unite and lead Israel's 12 tribes in political, military, and religious affairs. Deborah was the only woman of the 12 who served as a judge. She called for her general Barak to attack the Canaanites, who had 900 intimidating chariots. Barak famously replied, "I will go if you go with me, but if you don't go with me, I won't go either." She answered, "All right, I will go with you, but you won't get any credit for the victory, because the Lord will hand the Canaanite general Sisera over to a woman." And so they set off to battle. When Deborah told Barak to attack, he sent his army of 10,000 foot soldiers against Sisera's army. God threw Sisera's army into a disorganized retreat, pursued and slaughtered by Barak. Sisera fled on foot and appeared at the tent of Jael in a nearby tribe at peace. As was the custom of hospitality at that time, she gave him milk and a place to rest in her tent. While clearly upset that he had abandoned his troops in battle, Jael took a hammer and a tent peg and killed him by driving the tent peg through his skull. The Song of Deborah praises Deborah and Jael, noting, "May all your enemies die like that, and may your friends shine like the rising sun." Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes, "We never hear sermons pointing women to the heroic virtues of Deborah as worthy of their imitation. Nothing is said in the pulpit to rouse them from the apathy of ages, to inspire them to do and dare great things, to intellectual and spiritual achievements, in real communion with the great spirit of the universe." She continues saying, "Oh no, the lessons doled out to women from the canon law, the Bible, the prayer books, the catechisms, are meekness and self-abnegation, ever with covered heads, a badge of servitude, to do some humble service for man, that they are unfit to sit as a delegate in a Methodist conference, to be ordained to preach the gospel, or to fill the office of elder, of deacon or trustee, or to enter the Holy of Holies in cathedrals." Our next story is about Ruth, a story of deep commitment of caring for elders, even those related by marriage who are from a different group of people. Due to a severe drought, Naomi, her husband, and their 2 sons moved from Bethlehem across the Jordan River to Moab, where polytheistic people lived. Subsequently, her husband died, and her sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. 10 years later, both sons died. Fortunately, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth were very close and comforted each other. When the drought was over in Bethlehem, they all planned to move there, even though the daughters-in-law were not of Naomi's faith. As they started their journey, Naomi realized that her daughters-in-law would be better off among their own people. Each clan in those days was responsible for taking care of its own. In addition, the daughters-in-law would have better prospects for future husbands among their own people. They all cried. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and returned home as directed by Naomi. But Ruth refused to return. She held on to Naomi and said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And so Ruth left Moab and walked to Bethlehem together with Ruth, leaving her people behind and her family. Ruth was determined to take care of Naomi. One of the ways clans took care of their unfortunate members was to let widows and others glean the fields, that is, follow the workers and pick up any grain left behind. Ruth went out to a field to pick up the grain left behind after harvesting. This was how she planned to get by while caring for Naomi. Boaz, the owner of the field, was impressed that a foreigner would leave her own people and come to Bethlehem to care for her mother-in-law. The story ends with their marriage, which produced the ancestors of David and Jesus. And so it came to be that a non-Israelite Ruth would be in the lineage of Jesus. In summing up Ruth, many of the Bible story books focus on two things. It teaches how good things can come out of extremely difficult situations, and that Jesus, through King David and beyond, can trace his lineage to a Gentile, a non-Israelite, that is Ruth. And the book also discusses the themes of love and commitment. In my opinion, Ruth's concern for the survival of her mother-in-law, Naomi, shows a strength of character that exceeds that of some of the judges. Her story challenges us. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes, the tender friendship between Ruth and Naomi, so unusual with her mother-in-law, has been celebrated in poetry, in prose, and in art the world round. The scene between Naomi and her daughters in parting was most affectionate. Our last story concerns the Israelites who were exiled to Persia. The Persian king Xerxes fell in love with Esther and made her his queen. However, he did not know that she was an Israelite. Later, the king was tricked into signing a proclamation prepared by his prime minister, Haman. It would kill all the Israelites. Esther's uncle, Mordecai, pushed her to intervene with this famous quote, "Don't imagine that you are any safer than any other Jew because you are in the royal palace." At first, Esther was frustrated. People, including the queen, could see the king only if summoned before him. According to the law, if someone saw the king without being summoned, that person must die. Esther put on her royal robes and stood at the outer edge of the inner courtyard. When King Xerxes saw Queen Esther, he motioned with his gold scepter for her to come in. When he asked what she wanted, she replied she would like him and his prime minister, Haman, to be her guest at a banquet she was preparing for them that night. At her banquet, she invited them to come the next evening as her guests at another banquet. Then she would tell the king what she wanted. Over wine, the king asked her again what she wanted. He promised her she would have it. She asked that she and her people may live, for they had been sold for slaughter. When the king asked who would dare do such a thing, Esther said, "This man, Haman." The king left in a fury for the palace gardens. Haman, who was now in fear for his life, begged the queen for mercy. When the king returned to the room, he learned that Haman had just built a gallows for Mordecai. The king ordered Haman to be hanged, and he was hanged on the gallows he built for Mordecai. The king gave his ring with its seal to Mordecai and made him a key official in his palace. Esther told the king that she was related to Mordecai, and she made one more request. She begged the king to overrule the proclamation that Haman had issued in his name to slaughter the Jews throughout the empire. The king noted that he could not revoke a proclamation issued in his name and stamped with the royal seal. However, she or Mordecai could write the Jews whatever she wanted in his name and stamp it with the royal seal. Mordecai dictated a decree to the governors of the 127 provinces. The letter permitted the Jews to organize for their own self-defense. If they were attacked, they could fight back, kill their attackers, and take their possessions. The decree was delivered throughout the land by riders on royal horses. Jews filled the streets everywhere in relief and joy. On the day chosen for their destruction, the Jews attacked their enemies and destroyed them. In fact, the governors, administrators, and officials helped the Jews because they knew Mordecai was now a powerful official in the king's court. Mordecai and Esther sent letters to all the Persian Jews telling them to observe a holiday to celebrate their deliverance from Haman's planned slaughter. The Jews followed the instruction. The celebration became an annual custom known as the Festival of Purim. The book of Esther has two themes. Hatred brings destruction, and people in high places have a responsibility to help those who are powerless. Interestingly, the book does not contain the word God or any prayers in the original Hebrew version. Both were later added to the Greek translation. There was some reluctance by the Jewish and Catholic leaders to include the book of Esther among the books selected for their official holy scriptures, since there was no mention of God or prayers. It may have been included to explain the Purim holiday observed by Jews. The Purim is not mentioned in any other book. The Persian Jews brought the holiday with them to Jerusalem when they returned from their exile. As we wrap up, I think it's a good time to look at the compilation of the Bible. It is a collection of 66 books, written by more than 40 authors, such as kings, poets, prophets, musicians, farmers, teachers, a priest, a shepherd, and a fisherman. It was written in several styles, including stories, histories, letters, proverbs of familiar sayings, prophecies, songs, and poems. The books selected for the Bible were in common use and officially accepted by Jewish canon law around the 1st century CE and by the Catholics around the 4th century CE. But you may wonder, where was the editing? Elizabeth Cady Stanton's mixed views on the Bible and religion are summarized in her following closing words. There are some general principles in the holy books of all religions that teach love, charity, liberty, justice, and equality for all the human family. There are many grand and beautiful passages. The Golden Rule has been echoed and re-echoed around the world. There are lofty examples of good and true men and women, all worthy of our acceptance and imitation, whose luster cannot be dimmed by the false sentiments and vicious characters bound up in the same volume. She also offers this perspective on these Bible stories. The Bible cannot be accepted or rejected as a whole. Its teachings are varied. Its lessons differ widely from each other. Overall, she felt that parts of the Bible are so true, so grand, so beautiful, that it is a pity it should have been bound in the same volume with sentiments and descriptions so gross and immoral. I believe she sums up the view of many of us. There are many admirable Bible stories, among others, that are not uplifting at all. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you have questions or comments, please contact me at kenwalsh3@icloud.com. For more information on biblical characters, please consider my book, Bible Stories for All Without the Dogma. It is a rare book on just the key stories and their context without the religious dogma. The stories include Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Jacob and Esau, Joseph, Joshua, Deborah, Samson, Ruth, Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and of course, Esther. My booklet, The Ethics Seminar Guide, discusses contemporary ethical issues based on Bible stories. Both are available online. For more information, please consider my Facebook page at Ken Walsh Author. Scroll down for directions to my Classroom Google page with 35 pages of notes, 2 maps, 3 videos, and 87 paintings in the public domain. Or email me for copies if you do not have a Google account. If you do, you can go directly to classroom.google.com and enter the classroom code ZOSUF6N. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your interest. Take care.